Jeremiah's woes were unimaginable to our relatively peaceful lives. Now, whatever you've gone through today, I mean, even if you've gone through a car accident, compare what you're going through with what Jeremiah lived through, and this is just beyond basically our understanding. He lived through the death throes of the nation of Judah. I mean, the place was falling apart. In his lifetime, he saw the decay of God's chosen people. I mean, decay. They went from worshiping the true God to worshiping Satan and occultic shrines and all that, and that was horrible in itself. But also, he saw the horrible destruction of Jerusalem. Lamentations is the lament that he wrote from the death of Josiah, which was his hero, through the destruction of Jerusalem. Over those years, he wrote a lament, and that's called the Lamentations of Jeremiah. He saw also the deportation of the nation to Babylon. I mean, God's people were hauled away. He preached for 40 years and, listen, saw no visible result among those he served. There was not, as far as we know, there wasn't a single person that responded at all to his message. Not one convert, not one. In fact, his own relatives, we'll see in just a minute, tried to kill him. They didn't like him. He was causing problems. Instead, those countrymen he warned for God sought to kill him if he wouldn't stop preaching doom. That's in chapter 11. His own family and friends were involved in plots against him in chapter 12. God never allowed him to marry. Now, that's interesting. Did you know he was totally in the center of God's will? He was totally serving the Lord. He was totally an anointed man, chosen before his birth, and God says, I'm not going to let you get married. You know, some people spend their lifetime longing to be married, and maybe God's plan is that they not be married. This man, he experienced, listen, he suffered incredibly agonizing loneliness in chapter 16, and yet that was God's will. I think of the songwriter that wrote, God hath not promised skies always blue, flower-strewn pathways all our lives through, but God hath promised strength for today, light for the pathway, joy for the way. That's what God promised. He didn't promise that we were going to have, you know, a wonderful life and everything that possibly could bring us happiness. He just said, you'll have joy if you follow me. There were also plots to kill him in secret so no one would find him in chapter 18. He was beaten severely, tied up, and put into wooden stocks in chapter 20. His friends spied on him deceitfully and tried to get revenge against him in chapter 20. He was consumed with sorrow and shame. He got so depressed, he even cursed the day he was born in chapter 20. And finally, being falsely accused of being a traitor to his own country in chapter 37, he was arrested, beaten, thrown into a dungeon, and not fed for day after day in chapter 37. If an Ethiopian Gentile servant had not interceded on his behalf, he would have died there in the prison. I mean, they were just letting him rot. Kind of like if you read in the paper that 4-year-old girl that wouldn't hug her mother, the mother locked her in the room and starved her to death. That's what they were doing to Jeremiah. Only God kept him alive. In the end, tradition tells us, this is Jewish tradition, a lot of it is recorded in the Encyclopedia Judaica, which gives kind of like the national history of Israel that's not inspired. But they said that he was exiled to Egypt. He was stoned to death there in Egypt by his own people. And at the end of his life, as he went into the presence of the Lord, he had no converts to show for a lifetime of ministry. Think about that next time you get a missionary letter and you think, boy, we've been supporting them for 20 years and nothing's happened over there in that country. Think about the fact that a man who, when he spoke God's very words, and that everything he did, I mean, God said, go up to the river Euphrates. If you've read the book, it's really bizarre, some of the stuff. Go up to the river Euphrates. Take your sash off. And when you take that sash off, bury it in the mud and put it there and go walk back home. Now that's, several 100-mile walk and several 100-mile walk back. Then God says, now walk back up there. So he walks back up at least 300 miles. And when he gets there, he says, dig back down the dirt. And he pulled it out and his sash was all rotted. He said, take it back to Israel, Judah, and show them what I'm going to do to them. Even though he was a man like that had such incredible guidance and leading of the Lord, nobody followed him. But you know what? Our life in heaven is not measured by how many follow us and follow the Lord. It's whether or not, remember Christ's words, well done, thou good and faithful what? Servant. Did you do what I asked you to do? And whether it's like William Borden of Borden Dairy Company, the big wealthy family he was from. He was saved, he was called, he went to Egypt to prepare and learn the language of the Arab people. And while he was there in Cairo learning the language, he died of a rare disease, and he never told one person about Christ. And yet, his biography that was written, Borden of Yale, sent literally thousands of people to the mission field. And so through the death of one young man who gave up his millions and died in a slum in Cairo, thousands of people fanned out across the world. See, God's way of doing stuff is totally different than ours. I mean, we would have everyone be a winner. We'd have everyone be happy and healthy and have a lovely family life and have just total everything. But God says, no, some of you I'm going to let you agonize in loneliness, and others of you I'm going to let you have no visible results, and others of you are going to have a lifelong struggle with perhaps depression or perhaps struggling with some physical infirmity. And yet, as my grace is sufficient through that, I'm going to be glorified. That's what we learn from Jeremiah.